Over the rather large number of years I've been playing around with synthesizers and trying to record the odd bit of music, I've used quite a few different sequencers, but none of them have really felt quite right for me. They've always either lacked features or capabilities that I really wanted, or, especially with the more modern ones that have evolved into digital audio workstations, they have far too many features that just get in the way. I think that the only way to get a sequencer that really suits me is probably to write it myself. So this video is a sort of introduction to that project. First of all, I'll briefly talk about some of the sequencers I've used in the past. The first sequencer I ever used came with my first ever computer, a Yamaha CX5M. It came along with a music keyboard and a built-in sound module, which was in a completely different league to other computers at the time. The sound module was basically a Yamaha DX9 synthesizer, except a multi-timbral, and it was built into the side of a computer. The computer came with a sequencer called FM Composer, which the music tech guy has managed to get running in this video. To use it, you typed in your sequence in a simplified notation format with up to 8 parts. It was actually quite a nice interface for typing notation, but there was no real-time recording. The Yamaha sequencer was fun to use, but also a bit frustrating because of the slow interface and the limited input system. A few years on from that, I had switched to using a Windows PC for most tasks, and I wanted to use that for music as well. I got a version of Cubase called Cubasis Audio Lite, which came, I think, with a sound card. This screenshot is of a similar version of Cubase. It was very different to the Yamaha sequencer, much more powerful piece of software that let you have little bits of sequences, copy them, move them around, and basically it was very much better for electronic music. But it also had some frustrating limitations, and one that I found really annoying at the time was that it didn't have any notation input at all. I've upgraded Cubase a few times to get different features. This is a screenshot of the most recent version I have, which is Cubase 11. It's morphed from being a music sequencing program into a digital audio workstation, but it's also now very orientated towards built-in simulated synthesizers rather than the physical ones connected by MIDI, which is what I want to use. I really find this quite frustrating. One thing the newer versions of Cubase have, which I like, is retrospective record, but that means I might upgrade at some point. What I really want is the ability to hide or switch off all the VST-related features and get it back to just being a MIDI sequencer with added audio tracks, like my first one, Cubasis Audio, was. Another sequencer that I've got a copy of, because it came free with a bit of kit, is this cut-down version of Ableton Live. Like Cubase, it's oriented towards people doing a very different type of music production from me, although I suspect if I took the long amount of time needed to get into this program, I'd really like it, because I think the underlying concept is very nice. As the name implies, it's suitable for using live, and it lets the musician switch in and out of little sequence loops. I think that's something I really want in my sequencer. Cubase, in its modern form, and Ableton are really digital audio workstations rather than sequencers. And another piece of software that's not exactly a sequencer, but which has things I like a lot about it in it, is Band in a Box. This is really more of an accompaniment program for practicing along with, though it can also be used for making backing tracks. To use it, you just need to type in the chords, pick a style, and it comes back sounding quite amazing. You can just mute whatever it is you're playing, the piano in my case usually, and play along and have fun. It's good for practicing, but it's not great for doing electronic music, as that's not really within the set of styles it supports. So, and also I'd probably want to do something rather more original than you can do with Band in a Box, because it's basically a straightforward backing band. It does standard sounds. I've also played around with hardware sequencers very occasionally, and one I really like, of the one I like most, basically, of the ones I've tried, is Circuit Tracks. There's an awful lot to like about this, but there are also things that frustrate me. It's been designed so that people who don't play keyboards can use it, but at the same time that means it's got compromises which make it a lot less useful for people like me who do play keyboards. The individual sequences are really short as well, only a couple of bars, which I find a bit frustrating. But the way you can perform with it, switching in and out of sequences, is just great, and also adjusting sounds as you go. There's a YouTube channel called Gabe Miller Music, which is worth checking out just to see what can be done with this bit of kit. I think the fundamental problem with all these pieces of software and hardware is that they're not really aimed at someone like me, who has a few keyboards and just wants to play music for their own enjoyment. So I need to think what I really want from a music sequencer. Looking at these different options, what features are really important for me? I want it to be performance-oriented. Even though the audience for that performance is just my cat, because playing for fun is very like a performance. It needs to support creating new pieces too, of course, but having an interactive performance mode is essential. As part of that, I want to be able to switch sequences quickly, like the Circuit Tracks or Ableton Live, so that the structure of the piece can vary with each time I play it. I like the feature in Band in a Box where I can create a basic structure from a list of chords. So I want something like that, which might be at sequence level, or other times might be at full track level. I expect I'll want to use it in different ways at different times, so it needs to be quite flexible. And I'd also quite like it to be able to do home keyboard style chord recognition, shifting sequences to match the chord I play with my left hand. I know that's not a very professional feature, but I'm not a professional, and it can be fun. When it comes to putting this in the sequences, I want step time, because I'm not really a good enough player to do everything in real time, but I also want real-time recording. For setting up drum and percussion parts, I want to have a grid input, and maybe I want that to be available for arpeggios as well, which is a bit like one way of using the Circuit Tracks. For real-time input, I want to be able to set a sequence going and play along with it in a loop, and then select the best take later. Importing sections from MIDI files would also be a nice feature, although not an absolute essential. Something that lets me import something like channel 5 bars 2 to 10 into an individual sequence would be nice. So, with my list of requirements, and I would need to think what's the best way to progress with the project. In the past, I've had a few false starts with creating my own sequencer, and I've realized looking back, what has always gone wrong is a mixture of user interface issues and feature creep, and also just not having enough time to do the job. So this time, instead of making a conventional desktop application like the software sequencer that I looked at earlier, I'm going to do something a bit different. I'm going to build a simple core of the sequencer app and have it running on a Raspberry Pi with no built-in user interface. Obviously, it will need some way of controlling it, and for the sort of performance side of that, I'll use an Akai APC controller, something a bit like this with lots of buttons, which basically this grid of buttons can be used to send MIDI messages, and that will give me a basic user interface conceptually similar to the Circuit Tracks, or actually similar to using Ableton Live with the Akai controller, because that's what this is really designed for. I'll probably need a bit more than the APC when I'm creating a new track, so I'll have a web API that lets a remote web application control all of the different features. That means the user interface is completely separated from the rest of the application. So if I decide I don't like it, I'm just getting rid of a user interface and nothing else. It also means I can have different web apps to do different tasks rather than having a single big complicated user interface application. I'm going to stick with familiar technology as far as I can. I don't have time to learn new things at the moment to any great extent, and I also want to reuse as much as possible from my previous attempts at writing a sequencer. That means I'm going to be using C# as my programming language and Microsoft Visual Studio as my development environment. One final thing to speed things up, I will make use of AI where possible. This is not going to be like real vibe coding. Vibe coding, for those who are not familiar with this new crazy thing, is where someone uses AI to create a full application, just fixing things that go wrong by asking the AI to fix it and never actually doing any programming themselves, and usually ending up with something that superficially looks good and in reality is utterly atrocious. I'm going to stay fully in control and make sure I understand everything, I hope, and try to only rely on the AI for straightforward but boring bits of coding rather than any significant design decisions. That's what I'm going to be calling vibe-ish programming. I'll be doing the role of manager and senior developer, whereas proper vibe coders just take on the role of a clueless manager. So basically, my rules for vibe-ish coding, which I will try and stick to, are: it's a productivity tool, not a philosophy of programming. AI can be used for things that it seems to be good at, or at least in my experience, which is fairly boilerplate routines and acting as a documentation substitute by creating example code that uses libraries that aren't well documented and I'm not familiar with. My intention is only to let AI write code that I understand and to check absolutely everything. One further rule of AI-assisted coding that everyone should stick to is don't ever let AI write anything that has a security implication. At the moment, I'm near the start of this project, but I do have some useful code from my previous attempts to write a sequencer, which will be integrated into it. In preparation for this new and hopefully better version of my sequencer project, I have created a little test app to test the feasibility of some ideas and learn how to do some things. So this app is a MIDI router app that runs on a Raspberry Pi and with MIDI devices plugged into USB MIDI plugged in. It's got a command line interface that lets me set it up and direct messages from any of its input devices and channels to any output device and channel. And there's also a very simple control system that lets me switch a default input to different outputs based on pressing a MIDI controller button. So my main reason for writing this little test app was to learn to use the managed MIDI library, which is very different from the MIDI library I've used before, but importantly for this project works. It's compatible with the Raspberry Pi, which the one I've used before isn't. The documentation for this MIDI library was a bit sparse, but using AI to help, I was able to understand and use it, and also create an effective interface in a software terms, not in a user interface terms, that works nicely for my router app and will work for the bigger sequencer project later. So the next things I need to do are create enough of the design. Agile programming is great, but if you don't have a good plan to start with, it goes terribly wrong. I also need to make sure everything is nicely modular so that if I really change my mind in a big way, I don't have to throw away too much code. I also need to work out a good reachable first milestone, because particularly in a project like this where it's just me on my own, it's important to get something working early to keep momentum going and to keep enjoying what I'm doing. So I need to plan something that I can mostly put together using the existing code, but a bit more as well, and will give me a tool that does enough that I can have some fun playing with it. Quite early on, I need to write a tool to generate API functions from a simple spec, because these functions will need to have host side, client side, they'll maybe have C# client and JavaScript client, and for the web API that is, and ideally there will be a generated command line test interface for every bit of the API. So that's the sort of programming, generative programming, that can save an awful lot of time, because one specification generates 3 separate bits of code and helps avoid a lot of silly errors. And this also will help me link this project in slightly to my PhD, because it will make it an example project, a use case for my PhD. So that's where I am at the moment with my Perfect Music Sequencer project. I hope to make more videos soon showing progress, and I hope they'll be interesting to someone. Whether you're interested in this from the music side or from the software engineering side, hopefully I'll cover stuff that is of interest as I go along. So the next video in the sequence will probably cover the design and also lessons learnt from my previous attempts at writing a sequencer. But that's all for now. So hopefully I will see you soon with a follow-up video to this.